I'd like to take you all back to my 4th year of medical school, where I'm in Dayton, Ohio. I'd studied to become an obstetrician, at least that was my hope. And I had just recently gotten married to a wonderful guy that I met out here in California named Rami. And as long-distance relationships go, they're hard. And so I decided to do some of my away rotations out here in California. So the story takes place in California, where I'm really living across the street from a Muslim community center and seminary where we both had studied, and actually where Rami was working at the time. It's late at night, and I hear a really loud knock at the door. We both go to the door to see what's going on, and as we open it, I notice a young woman who I had actually met and seen before at the community center, but before I could say anything, she just runs right past me into the apartment. We're both kind of shocked. So we both run back to see where she is and can't actually find her at first. Eventually we find that she's ducked under a couch, and I try to get to her eye level to see what's going on. And I say to her, "Are you okay? Can I help you? What's going on?" And then she looks at me with really wide, kind of terrified eyes, and she says, "I need to speak to the imam, the religious leader." And I say to her, "But the imam isn't here, not in this apartment." And she says, "No, he's here. You must get him for me." And then I notice that she's looking past my shoulder at something. So I turn to look and see what it is, but there's really nothing there. And I try to calm her down and tell her, "How about we try to go find the imam? Maybe he's in the community center." And at this point, she runs right back out the apartment. And so Rami and I go running after her to figure out what happened and what's going on and is she okay? And then we hear that now she's in the community center and she's talking to the other individuals, asking them for the imam as well. And they're also telling her that the imam is not present. But then I hear them say, "Maybe something's wrong. Maybe we should pray for her." And they all agree in unison that really we should pray for her. And they start to pray for her. And some people say, maybe she's possessed. Maybe we need to read scripture over her. And while all of this is unfolding, Rami says, "I think I need to call one of our elders." So he calls, out of all people, he decides to call a dentist. This particular dentist, Dr. Rajab Ali, is actually one of the elders of our community who had often would speak about in his Friday congregational sermons about all kinds of social things such as mental health, substance abuse, homelessness, all kinds of topics that were typically taboo and really weren't discussed much in the Muslim community. And when Rami described to Dr. Rajab Ali what was unfolding and how the community was saying all she needs is prayer, he said to him, "This is a psychiatric emergency. This is a psychotic episode. She needs to go to the emergency room. Try to get her to go." And it was interesting that nobody had actually, that even crossed their minds, that this was actually maybe something that needed medical attention. And so at that point, Rami and some others tried to help this young woman to get some help. It took some time. Eventually, she did get the help she needs. When Rami came back later that evening, he said to me, "You know, Rania, there are many good people out there who can deliver a baby safely. But there are not many people who have studied the Islamic sciences like you have that can help the mental health of our community." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, have you considered psychiatry?" And I thought, "No, why would I do that?" And he said, "Because it might be useful to this community." And I just kept thinking of that young woman and really trying to figure out what this meant. I had completed all of my advanced medical rotations in obstetrics, lined up all my letters of recommendations for obstetrics, was ready to apply for my residency training, and now I had to consider doing it all over again for a field that I'd never really even thought about or considered. And so I tried to break the news to my friends and family. The first thing out of my mother's mouth was, "What do you mean you're not going to be a surgeon?" Like the rest of your family members who are doctors. Another member of the family said, "You're wasting your medical education. What is this psychiatry? A friend said to me, nobody in our community is going to go to you. We don't go to psychiatrists. We just pray. And it really spoke to the stigma around mental health in this community and many others as well. And I often wondered, what is it that holds people back from getting the kind of support and care they need? Needless to say, I tried my hand at psychiatry, put in my applications, got to my interview, and one of the program directors said to me, so do you want to become a psychiatrist or an obstetrician? It turned out one of my letters of recommendation had still snuck in saying obstetrics. I had a lot to explain, not just to them, but also to myself. When I got here to Stanford, where I did my training in psychiatry, I got here with a lot of trepidation, honestly. A lot of anxiety around, do I really fit in? Am I in the right place? Am I doing the right thing? And actually, will I really be useful to anybody at all? The first place I visited was the Stanford libraries. I had spent a lot of time in seminary kind of actually reading ancient manuscripts from antiquity, and I thought somebody must have written something about Islam and mental health. I had never grown up ever seeing or hearing of a connection between the two, but certainly somebody wrote something. And so in that process, my student office at Stanford, if you had walked in at the time, were piles and piles and piles of manuscripts from 7th century, 8th century, 9th century. It was pretty cool for the nerds, you know? And then I came across a manuscript by a 9th century scholar named Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. And I was really interested in what he was writing because as a psychiatrist in training, I felt like I was reading from the 9th century descriptions of depression, anxiety, descriptions of trauma. And then I got to a section in this book that looked suspiciously familiar to what we today would call obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. The only problem is, the lecture we had just had from the forefather of OCD in this country, the first person to have an OCD clinic in the country, was right down the hall from me at Stanford. The guru for OCD, the guy who wrote every textbook there is on the topic. And he had just delivered a lecture in which he taught us that OCD was actually a modern illness, not discovered until the 19th century, of course, by a white European guy. And as I'm reading Balkhi's manuscript in the 9th century, I'm just sort of amazed, but it took a lot of effort to convince myself to go down the hall and knock on his door. And when I finally mustered up the courage to do so, and went ahead and knocked on his door, and I said, I think I found something a lot earlier than what your textbook says. At first, he just sort of waved me away and said, no. I'm a history buff. And here are my papers about the Romans, and here are my papers about the Greeks, and here's this, and here's that. And as he was going on, I finally said to him, but can you read in Arabic? And he said, no, can you? Yes. And he did the very professor thing and said, why don't you go ahead and translate that and come back? So I did. I spent the next couple of weeks translating this section of Balkhi's manuscript and invited him back to my office, where I had created this slide deck where I kind of compared the DSM, which is the manual for diagnosing any psychiatric or psychological illness, along with Balkhi's criteria of OCD from the 9th century side by side. And when he saw this, I kid you not, he started to jump in my office. He was jumping in the office. And he said, this must be published. And I hadn't even thought about publishing. It was really a personal journey. But he insisted. And so, in fact, we did publish this paper, and it became one paper after another, after another, after another. And eventually, this actually founded my lab, the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab. It sounds simple, but it took me 3 years to convince Stanford to put it on their website, until I finally marched up to leadership and said, is it because it says Muslim before the lab's name? And they're like, no. Needless to say, in a week's time, it was on the website. What do we do in this lab? Well, research all kinds of mental health conditions of Muslim populations. And one of the main things that I'm really passionate about is understanding how do you help holistic care for mental illness? Particularly, how do you speak to communities who have so much stigma because their impression of psychology and psychiatry is that it's very Eurocentric, white, thing to do is go speak to somebody in therapy. Where in reality is, a lot of what I was finding are people like Belkhi who actually didn't work alone in silos. They worked as part of institutions. They worked in hospitals, except they didn't call them hospitals. They called them healing centers. In Arabic, Dar al-Shifa literally translates into a healing center. Or in Farsi, in Persian, Bimaristan literally means the place where a sick person goes to heal. What was incredible, and this is the current book that I'm writing, is on the Merisstand, which is really rewriting the history of psychology to say, look, these institutions, these healing centers, had all of the medical conditions side by side in one location. They didn't discriminate between mental health and physical health. You had internal medicine, surgery, pediatrics, and psychiatry. They are the first institutions in the world that actually treated psychiatric illness from a medical model within their hospital setting. They become the blueprint for the modern hospital system. But I bet you didn't learn that like I didn't learn that in our psychology courses. My dream, my hope, the work of this lab, and also the nonprofit organization that I helped co-found is exactly this. It's called Meristan, and the whole goal is to bring holistic mental health care to all populations, but really being able to heal fragmented people, mind, body, and soul. To really be able to bring in holistic healing from the very architecture of the buildings to the process that's happening in them, the talk therapy, the art therapy, and also the greenery, the fountains, the beauty that's there in order to heal internally and externally. This is my dream and my hopes. I hope you'll join me in this journey. Thank you.